Today on Uncommon Knowledge, is No Child Left Behind making the grade?
Funding for this program is provided by the John M. OLIN Foundation.
Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Our show today, a report card for the No Child Left Behind Act. In 2001, President Bush signed into law the No Child Left Behind Act, a bipartisan effort to increase federal funding for our public schools and to mandate national education standards. At the time, critics were troubled, either by the expansion in federal power over education or by the creation of these national education standards. Today, almost half a decade later, has No Child Left Behind been a success? If not, what do we need to do to fix it? Joining us, two guests. Martin Carnoy is a professor of education and economics at Stanford University, and John Chubb is chief education officer at Edison Schools Incorporated and a fellow at the Hoover Institution. Harvard education professor Richard Elmore on the 2001 No Child Left Behind Act. Quote, "The single largest and the single most damaging expansion of federal power over the nation's education system in history." Close quote. Is he right about that, Mark?
Partially.
Partially. All right, we'll come back to that. John?
No. No Child Left Behind has the potential to be an historic act to move American education forward like it's never been moved before. It's far from perfect, but...
All right. No Child Left Behind Act of 2001, signed into law by President George W. Bush, Republican of Texas, but one of its champions in Congress was Senator Edward Kennedy, Democrat of Massachusetts. In other words, broad bipartisan support. The act mandated certain national standards, and since it went into effect in 2001, has augmented federal spending on education by some $7.4 billion, an increase of some 43%. Now, let me quote you something from the White House website. The priorities in No Child Left Behind are based on the fundamental notion that an enterprise works best when responsibility is placed closest to the most important activity of the enterprise. Here we're talking about educating kids, and when those responsible are given the greatest latitude and support, close quote. But if that is true, then what is the federal government doing intervening in such a massive manner in a role that has traditionally been left to the 50 states? John?
What the federal government is saying for the very first time is that every child in America, regardless of where they live and regardless of what the spending happens to be in the city or the state in which they live, deserves to get an education that takes them to a reasonable level of proficiency that gives them an opportunity to take advantage of all that this country has to offer. And that's a very important statement that the nation has never made. It's always been left to the states, and I think it's very important that this happens.
And you would agree with the implicit assertion that the states couldn't do it on their own, or weren't doing it?
The states have demonstrated that they cannot do it on their own. There was a very strong movement in this country towards accountability during the 1990s. So it's not as if the federal government or President Bush or Senator Kennedy was leading the charge. There was a lot of momentum towards holding schools accountable and insisting on a decent level of performance in the 1990s. But what the federal government did was to say, there's no reason in the United States why, if you grow up in Pennsylvania or grow up in California or grow up in Michigan, that your reading achievement should differ, or that your basic math achievement should differ. And so the federal government stepped up and said, we're going to insist on a level of quality across all of these jurisdictions.
We'll come to the provisions, specific provisions of the bill in a moment, but Martin, does the federal expansion of power, the intervention in education, trouble you, or that's just
not at all?
Not remotely. You're
Not
with John
remotely.
on that one.
Federal government intervention is not, to me, the main issue. The main issue is that if you're going to try to improve schools, I think you have to meet three criteria. You have to be able to identify the problem correctly. You have to then put incentives in that respond in some way to that problem. And then you have to bring the resources into play to help people meet the goals.
Right.
Only the second, No Child Left Behind has only addressed the second issue. there's an assumption about what the problem is, and that is not enough effort.
Let's look at some. No Child Left Behind embraced several fundamental goals: accountability, transparency, choice, and better teaching. Let's look at each in turn. Accountability first. Under No Child Left Behind, every state must already, been enacted in 2001, be giving reading and math tests to students in grades 3 through 8, then testing them again at least once in high school. Now, let me quote from a report by the Correct Task Force on Education, of which you were a member, and you edited the report. Quote, "What is important here is that schools are accountable not for delivering education to students, but for actually educating them," close quote. Now, explain that distinction between delivering education and actually educating.
Well, the schools for a long time have been held accountable for making sure that school's in session for 180 days a year,
Right.
for making sure that school's open 6 hours a day or whatever a state may choose, to make sure that they're using the right kinds of textbooks, making sure teachers have the right credentials and so forth. But only in the last 10 or 15 years have our states, and now more recently the federal government, said, well, you know, regulating all of those things is really not getting us the achievement that we want. We have too many kids dropping out. Our kids' test scores don't measure up to other countries. So we really need to think about holding schools accountable, not for the process, but for the outcomes. That is, for making sure the kids actually get an education. And this is the first time that the federal government, which has been providing money to inner city schools and to low-income schools for some time, it's the first time the federal government has said, what we really care about are the outcomes.
We've got several years of experience. Has it made a difference? Is it working?
Well, for No Child Left Behind, it's really too early to say. It's only been in operation for 3 years, but there's several bits of evidence that I think point to this being a step in the right direction. One
I
is,
warn you that the look on his face suggests he's going to come back at you. But go ahead.
and there's, and with any new law, you have to give it some time. But back in the 1990s, states that adopted the kind of accountability provisions, that is, for kids reaching standards and having some consequences, incentives, or sanctions, states that adopted accountability provisions like No Child Left Behind made more achievement gains than states that did not. So that's some prior evidence.
You cited my paper.
Yes, that's right. You wrote a paper on accountability, studying the states, right?
Exactly.
In math.
In math only.
On math only.
The second thing is that if you just look at the last couple of years across school districts, the Council of Great City Schools, which represents all of the major school districts in America, they concluded that the doubling of the improvement rate in proficiency gains for those schools was attributable in part to No Child Left Behind.
All right, so you wrote a major report, which I have looked at, but a paper?
A published paper.
In which you examined this question of accountability and concluded, as this layman grasped it, that accountability is good.
No, yes, definitely. Between 96 and 2000, in terms of math scores,
This is state accountability programs.
right.
This is prior
it looked
to No Child Left
It looked to
Behind.
us. Now, when you measure accountability, we tried to actually rate the states.
Accountability means testing kids,
Well,
right?
it's more than testing kids, because it's
And
also
consequences.
and consequences. Testing plus consequences.
Okay.
And so we rated the states from 1 to 5, 0 to 5, I'm sorry, 0 to 5, and found that those states at 5, actually between 3 and 5, did better than the states down at 0, 1. Okay, but the issue of 2000, 2003 is less clear. Okay, in fact, when we try it,
The results get blurry all of a
the
sudden?
results get blurry. What happens is, it's rather complex, because the states that did well in math in the 1990s now have slowed down. You know, the curve tops out. And so you can say, we won't know until the next period of time. I agree with John. I mean, you can't make a judgment on 3 years. So we won't know. But I don't...
By the way, what do you need? 5 years, a decade? What do you need to know?
Well, we see over the long haul, but you have to say this. Let me tell you this. The math scores, at least for minorities, have been going up with a little hiatus in the late 80s since the mid-1970s. And the math scores for everybody have been going up since 1990, quite steadily. Okay.
So
reading
there's no way
scores...
to say whether this provision of No Child Left Behind, the accountability provision, has done any good at all.
we do have some evidence that it would do well, but in this,
The question is really whether it's enough and what more we need. I don't think there's any dispute.
no,
that
we're not disagreeing about
holding
this.
holding schools accountable for outcomes, I think, has had a positive influence.
I agree.
Probably
Has anybody
explains-
been held accountable yet, by the way?
Yes.
Under No Child Left Behind,
Yeah.
has any school taken it in the neck for delivering bad test scores?
Well,
The reason I asked that question,
Very few.
the reason I asked that question is because the
just to be-
provisions of the bill seem to have teeth, but on the other hand, politicians would
Let's
rather
put- let
give
me-
money to
Kids
institutions
are
let's
being
let's
than
be
punish
let's
them,
be
right?
clear with what's happening.
All right, go ahead.
When schools fail for 3 consecutive years,
Whatever that means.
by the definition of No Child Left Behind, if they fail to make adequate progress for 3 consecutive years, the kids
Treat
the
me
kids
as a skeptic in the following sense. Treat me as
kids-
somebody who says
the
the
kids in
politicians
those-
will never administer the punishment.
Well, here's
They're going to let the schools
here's
slip
one
slide
thing.
away.
Here's one thing that's happening.
Satisfy that fear
Okay.
on my part.
Well, one of the things that No Child Left Behind says is that if a school fails for 3 years, the kids in that school are eligible for private tutoring.
We have 3 years
Okay,
experience.
so
Has anybody
you're
failed
eligible
for 3 years?
Yes, they have, and in the
Federal money
country,
could be Title
right,
I schools.
Title I schools,
Which are
those
schools that receive
high
federal
poverty
money for
high
tutoring.
poverty schools receiving
Okay.
federal money. Those kids are eligible for something that they never had before, which is that their parent can go to Sylvan Learning Centers or Princeton Review or Kaplan and get tutoring.
And this is actually happening.
Yes,
Some of these
$1,500 a kid, and there are now millions of kids in the country who are receiving private tutoring because their schools are failing.
Okay, this brings us to
And that's
choice.
Failing schools. This brings us to the choice provision of No Child Left Behind.
Correct task force, quote, disadvantaged students are given a power that middle and upper income students have always had to choose a better school in a different neighborhood. They leave the bad school and they get to move to another neighborhood. This thereby injects an element of the free market into the education system, close quote. You are a stout proponent of this choice provision of No Child Left Behind.
We believe that if a school is failing, that in addition to efforts to improve the schools, that parents in the schools should have options, and No Child Left Behind provides that. We also find, though, that the choice provision No Child Left Behind is not being effectively used, partly because there aren't good schools for the kids to choose from, partly because the districts are doing a very poor job of informing parents that they have the choice. And the only provision of the law that really is working is the tutoring provision. I mean, working in the sense that kids are taking advantage of it. We don't know whether Sylvan or Princeton Review or Kaplan or anybody else is making a difference for their achievement, but we do know that millions of kids are getting tutoring. Inner city kids are getting tutoring that right now middle-class parents are paying for. And
So that sounds
that's
good.
likely
I
to
like
be
the tutoring.
likely to be a positive.
You like the tutoring?
I like the tutoring.
Okay,
I believe in tutoring. Here's the
So
problem
that-
with
and it's-
here's the problem with the choice provision.
all right.
I agree with John. It's good to give people choice. Always good to give people choice. They like choice. So I'm not against choice. But here's the problem. The problem is that it is assumed that the choice schools will be better than the public schools because the public schools are failing. But
Was that really the assumption, or is it simply
Martin, it's
assumed
not-
that the
it's
parents will be able to figure it out?
They can choose. I mean, most of the choices are of other neighborhood district schools. I mean, they can choose a charter school, but most of their choices are of other public schools. You know, if you're at PS2 and it's failing, you can choose PS3 or PS1.
If that were the real criterion that we're going to now send kids to other public schools, in fact, 25 to 30% of kids in these target populations are changing schools all the time anyway. So there's huge turnover in these schools.
Within
which
school
nobody
district, from school to school?
Yeah. and
There's a
because-
lot in inner cities because of parents changing rental
I see.
apartments and
Yeah,
so
I
forth.
see.
It's just
Okay.
there's a lot of mobility.
He runs Edison schools. He knows better than anybody what the turnover rates in these schools are. I mean,
it's high.
It's a very big challenge for schools.
it's the little thing that nobody talks about.
That
It
there's
is
turnover in the
yes,
first
for a
place. It's
lower
already
income
taking place.
kid to keep changing schools is fatal to their
Makes
scores.
it very hard for
Yeah.
schools to educate.
So
them. They're like a moving
every
target.
school, whether it be a charter school or whether it be a thing, faces this problem.
And No Child Left
But what
Behind
doesn't
fails,
deal with
fails
it.
to address it
Doesn't deal
altogether.
with it.
There's
Doesn't even
nothing-
talk about it.
There's really little that a law can do about student mobility. But what the law does make possible, and it's really just a small part of the problem, is that if there are schools that are utter failures, parents can opt out of them, and ultimately, and it's
that
important
is
to say-
happening. I continue to
really-
have this
It's-
fear.
it's-
But you know what's really
happening- it's
strange?
happening at a very
What's
low
really
level.
strange is what they define as utter failure is that the school scores don't go up. Okay, the school scores are low and they don't go up, but they might not be going up because there's such high turnover of the student
Well,
body.
Martin, to be fair, the law only counts kids who've been continuously enrolled for a year when they do the.
Next, making school performance transparent.
Under No Child Left Behind, these tests are used to compile annual report cards for schools, they're called, rating schools as either making more than adequate annual progress, making adequate progress, or failing to make adequate progress. And the scores from students in certain groups, boys scores, girls scores are separated, racial minorities are separated out, special ed students are separated out. All these things are separated so you can see them. Again, I'll quote from your Correct Task Force, John. Quote, "The law provides visibility into school performance that parents, citizens, policymakers, and the media have never had," close quote. Isn't that at least something of an overstatement? I mean, real estate values reflect what's going on in schools. People know whether schools are good or bad. No?
If you go back 10 or 15 years, parents in particular had very little idea of what the test scores looked like for the schools because they weren't
true.
published at all, and that's
I
moved
don't
forward.
disagree with this.
But what's especially important about No Child Left Behind is the publication of the subgroups, because special education kids, for example, nobody without this law would understand how those kids are doing. Racial minorities it would not be clear. Schools have been
No
able
problem
to
with
sort of
this.
hide behind their
problem with
overall
it.
performance.
This
Yeah.
is not the issue.
Okay.
The issue is, does No Child Left Behind address the real educational problems? Do they identify the problem correctly? The answer is no. And the problem is identified as these low-scoring public schools, that the public schools are ineffective. Let me tell you, it's a very small part of the problem. I've just identified one issue, high mobility rates. That's a big problem. Second issue, very bad conditions in the kids' families, bad nutrition, no preschool, all kinds of other issues not addressed by No Child Left Behind. Although they're beginning.
But the point is the law supposed to address everything? I mean,
No, the law is diverting attention from these issues.
No,
Hold on.
that's
Absolutely.
You argue that the law actually does no harm, does harm.
No, it does
I mean,
no
it's one
harm,
thing
does very little good.
It does very little
Does
good.
very little good.
It's irrelevant.
Shifting,
Puffing and puffing,
in
and spending
fact,
billions of dollars, and it does very little
giving
good.
choice to parents is a good thing from the parents feeling good about choice, but the question is it doing well for the kids?
back
Do another public-
to
This is the-
basics here. But back to basics. There are lots of things that make educating kids difficult, such as their family situation, such as their mobility, and other things that you identify. But that doesn't mean that an effort that what No Child Left Behind tries to do, which is to say, we have to begin somewhere, which is we have to have standards, we have to hold the schools
I disagree.
accountable, we have to provide options for parents, and we have to have some sanctions that will get rid of the schools that are really bad. Those are good things.
But you're not
Let me
getting rid
quote
of
you
the
to
schools that are
yourself.
really bad.
Martin, let me
You're
quote you to
introducing a
yourself.
lot of new schools that are really bad.
Martin Carnoy, quote,
Now, what would Martin Carnoy do to reform No Child Left Behind?
Martin Carnoy will now give me the three most important reforms in, let's say, a redrafting of No Child Left Behind. We have the beginning of the second Bush administration. We make you president.
Well,
We
then-
replace Bush with you, and you now get to give me what you do.
I would invest heavily in preschool education in these areas, in high-quality preschool education. The evidence is mounting that this makes a difference. I would invest heavily in out-of-school programs.
Preschool education is nursery school? Just
2 to 5 years old.
it makes sure that the kids are well fed and well cared for, but what
And
actual
enriched.
education goes on?
Through Head Start or through an alternative to Head
I would
Start?
expand Head Start.
Okay.
I would expand Head Start down to 2 years old. And in fact, the evidence suggests that in the early years of education anyway, coming out now of the Eccles data, the early childhood longitudinal survey, that in fact, the only decline that occurs for the low-income kids occurs in the summer, not during the school years.
There's a lot,
So
there's a lot
that's
of
just,
evidence.
it's the home environment that's the problem.
No, the opportunities outside of school.
Oh, I
It's
see.
when they're outside of when they're in the school, they're
doing okay.
See,
being
that's why,
reinforced.
that's why I
when
like
they're at home.
tutoring.
Yeah.
See, that's why I like
Right.
tutoring. I think the additional stuff that's done by tutoring or after-school programs.
You'd expand Head Start? You're with him on that?
Early childhood education does make a difference. Yes, Head Start has its flaws, but still, it's a good way to
Give me
spend
another
money.
reform.
I would really, I agree with John. I would start implementing action to try to attract higher quality people
Can I
into teaching.
What is the problem? Per capita spending in real terms on education, public schools, has gone up in recent decades. At the same time, we continue. What's the problem with teaching? That other jobs relative to teaching have become more attractive?
Absolutely.
Other jobs have opened up for women. It used to be that women.
Rick,
Is that part of it as well?
All of that's part
Rick
of it.
Hanish,
Okay.
part
All
of the
that's part
current
of it.
task
So in
force.
real terms, you have to pay teachers more in order to stay even, so to speak. Is that
Absolutely,
right?
absolutely. The fact is that you can't use this consumer price index to decide, which is what we buy on a day-to-day, to decide what happened in education. Because the only thing you're really buying in education is labor. And the price of female professional labor went up a lot faster than the consumer price index. So just to stay even,
Right, no, that's absolutely true.
he faces that every day.
But the
He's got to
question,
recruit
yeah,
teachers.
absolutely. But the question is, what do you do about it? And pay is part of it, but also working conditions are part of it, and you know, what it's like to teach in inner city schools. I mean, what we find is that if you have a professor, a principal who knows how to run a school and can maintain an orderly environment, you have esprit de corps, you can attract good teachers into an inner city environment. But if the system is broken, then teachers will opt for the easier kids to educate.
Give me your reforms.
Finally, what John Chubb would do to reform No Child Left Behind.
What would you do to change No Child Left Behind? You're advising Bush.
I'm going to stick strictly with No Child Left Behind. One is we would recommend making tutoring available to kids earlier, not after the school fails 3 years in a row, but after it fails 2 years in a row, because tutoring should be effective. Second, we think that the state standards should be pegged to the national test, which is known as NAEP, because right now the states are lowering their standards in order to comply with No Child Left Behind.
They're lowering their standards.
They're lowering.
The states define what's proficiency.
They're redefining.
States still are permitted to.
The states get to define proficiency. The Department of Education is supposed to provide oversight, but basically the states are lowering their standards, and it's kind of a race to the bottom, and that has to stop. Otherwise, the law is a sham.
It doesn't bother you at all that what you're suggesting here tends to aggregate power in federal hands?
No, it doesn't at all. I mean, the country should stand up and say what's an adequate education for kids in this country, and it shouldn't differ whether you're in Mississippi or California or what have you.
Other adjustments or reforms.
So we do that. On the teacher provisions, we believe that the requirements for all teachers should be that you have a bachelor's degree, that you have a major in the subject you're teaching, or that you pass a test, and that should apply to new teachers and to veteran teachers.
And again, that's the question of having the federal government impose rules on the states where the states are not doing an adequate job.
Because the states are using their discretion to water down the requirements, and it's important that we have good teachers, and it's important that we weed out people who are not doing a good job. So those are the top of the list.
Why do the states and localities do such a bad job? They're the people who are, you can't say from Washington, D.C., that money needs to be well spent in Santa Clara, California. I don't understand. I mean, where's the political breakdown here?
Well, the people of California have decided that they do not want to spend as much money as the people of New York State. I grew up in New York State. People were willing to pay their property taxes in New York State because they felt that they wanted to send their kids to good public schools in the suburbs of New York. They spent a fortune. My high school today is spending $16,000 or $17,000 per kid. That's double what Palo Alto High School spends.
To get back to the point about local control, and this really gets to the heart, I think, of No Child Left Behind, is that many communities, for whatever reason, tradition, distribution of political power, low expectations, just have not asked much of their schools, and that's under a system of local control. If you're a little rural community, that's your right. If kids have normally left school after 10th grade and gone to work in a factory, that's your right. But what the federal government and the states really before the federal government said is, no, if you're a local public school system, we're going to insist on a certain level of performance. And that's new. I think it's important. It doesn't solve all the problems, but it absolutely is.
What's really interesting is that the southern states have been traditionally, until very recent years, much more centralized financially, totally centralized financially.
State Board of Education in Mississippi runs the whole show in Mississippi.
No, state financing.
The finances.
I see. And what prospect do you see for any of those reforms to be enacted? Do you sense that the Bush administration is actually interested in adjusting
Unfortunately,
the
I think what's happening is I think the Bush administration is resting on its laurels a bit. I think they're very pleased that they got this law passed. I think they're pleased with the early evidence of its success. They don't have to do anything with it for several years because reauthorization hasn't come up, and I think they are fearful that if they acknowledge the issues and open it up legislatively, that anything could happen.
Gentlemen, last question. Last question. The stated goal, this is in the legislation of the No Child Left Behind Act, is to ensure that by the year 2014, every student in the country will be able to demonstrate proficiency in reading, math, and science by passing state tests. 2014, will every child in the country truly be able to demonstrate proficiency? In other words, will it work? What do you think?
I think they will, because I think the states will lower the proficiency standard.
I'm less cynical than that. Right now, about half the kids in the country are meeting standards as set by the state. I think we could get to maybe 75%.
So you think it's working?
No,
I think it can work.
I think they can do it in math. Because
Reading is tougher.
Reading is tougher. Why? Because reading is a cognitive skill, and math is a cognitive process. It's very hard to...
Math is a school-taught skill, and
It's
reading
absolutely.
is something that's dependent on your language environment.
SAT scores on math are a function of how many math courses you took.
I see.
Literally.
I
It's
see.
the single best explainer.
I see.
Reading is not that.
All right. Gentlemen, alas, you've just opened up another topic. We could do another show, but we can't. John Chubb, Martin Carnoy, thank you very much. I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge. Thanks for joining us.
We welcome your comments on this week's show. Our email address, comments@uncommonknowledge.tv. For more information about Uncommon Knowledge, please visit our website, www.uncommonknowledge.tv.
Funding for this program was provided by the John M. Olin Foundation.